Hello, I'm Juliet Sear. Welcome to bakingmad.com. Today I'm going to show you how to prepare a sponge ready for marzipan and icing. This can be used for wedding cakes or celebration cakes, but I'm going to show you a few tips to make sure that you can really foolproof your cake covering because we want it to look perfect. So first of all, I'm going to start with a vanilla sponge. You can use any sponge at all. You could have frozen this in advance if you wanted to. Now when you're doing your own wedding cake or perhaps a friend's, you might take a few days to decorate it, so you might want to save some time. So you can freeze these in advance, or equally you can buttercream this how I'm going to show you now and then put it in the freezer and take it out, bring it to room temperature for a few hours and you're ready to go. This one's slightly shallow, so a good tip, I'm just going to take a cake drum. This one's a 5-inch cake drum. This cake is a 6-inch, so I'm going to pop that cake drum inside. Now, by popping the sponge back in, that's kind of lifted it up just enough so I can get a really nice flat base. So I'm going to take a bread knife, just hold the cake at the top and just go across, just using the top of the tin as a guide, all the way around. I like to go in this kind of circular motion just to make sure it's completely level. As you can see, straight away, I've got a really nice level base to start with. So I'm just going to do another one of my dad's top tips. Now I'm going to cut this sponge. I'm going to be using a cake leveler today. This is a cake leveler. If you do a lot of baking, they're quite handy. But if you haven't got one of these, by doing this tip, it's going to make sure it's all level anyway. So I'm just going to make a mark in the side of my sponge. Just a very small kind of nick. Because when I cut through this sponge, no matter how careful I am, you're going to get undulations in it. So when you put it back together, sometimes you might find it's a bit wonky. So by having that mark, it means I can do it like a jigsaw puzzle and actually put it together and it's going to be completely perfect. So, and just bring that across just to make one cut. And then just do that again, just for my next layer. Okay. So I'm also going to be using the bottom, the piece that I've cut off as the bottom of my cake, because I want to use the part that was in the tin as the top, because it's slightly smoother. So I'm going to take the bottom layer and I'm going to use a cake drum. So these are the best things to use when you're doing wedding cakes or celebration cakes because they're quite a nice thickness, especially if you're making tiered cakes. And when I work with the marzipan and the icing, it's going to make it a lot easier for me to get a smooth surface to push against. So I would recommend using one of those. So I'm going to take a small amount of buttercream and just to stick my first layer. So just pop that on there. Just push it down. Okay. Also, I'm going to use a turntable. Again, I do a lot of baking. If you are really into cake making and baking, having a turntable is quite handy because you can move it round and it's going to make it much easier for working with your marzipan. But again, if you don't have one, you can always just use a spare cake drum, but they are quite a good investment if you are into cakes and baking. So I also like to work on another spare drum just because when I'm working with my cakes, I'll be working with them over a few days, so it makes it easy for me to kind of move them about. So take my first one and just place some buttercream in the middle. Just using a palette knife, I'm just going to kind of go around, just spreading that using a kind of palleting motion backwards and forwards, just to try and get it completely level. There we go, just not too much, just a couple of millimetres of filling's perfect. So there we go. And now take my next layer. So now I'm looking for my mark where I made, it's always covered up by the buttercream, there we go. So that's my mark that I made with my, oh no, there it is. There's the indentation I made with my knife. So I'm going to make sure that I'm lining up the next piece. So, there it is. Yep, so just line that up. So another layer of buttercream. Again, I could use a couple of different flavours. I could use a layer of strawberry. So just make sure, again, just a nice thin layer. So now just press it down. Let's give it a bit of a push with my spare drum there. just to make sure all of the buttercream is squeezed out. So just a very thin layer going all the way round. This also helps to fill any, you might have some little lumps and bumps and gaps, so this is again starting to make sure it's filled up nicely, nice and smooth and straight. Just get off the excess from the top. And just go all the way around just to kind of take any excess buttercream off. Just make sure that's smooth. So now I'm going to put this in the fridge to chill. It's a good idea to put it in the fridge for at least a couple of hours. Again, at this point you could freeze it. And then when it's nice and firm, I can come back and do my first coat of marzipan. So the first job is to add a bit of jam, just so I can stick my marzipan onto my cake. So I've got some apricot jam here. I've added a tiny bit of water and just boiled it for a couple of minutes, just to make sure it's boiled. You can do it in the microwave if you want to. So I'm just going to brush the apricot jam all over the surface of my cake. So that's all covered in jam, it's nice and sticky. Earlier on, when I was covering my cake with buttercream, I knocked a bit off the side, as you can see here. This happens a lot. Don't worry, if you make a mistake with cake decorating, you can always pull it back. So I'm just going to take a small amount of marzipan. Now what I'm looking for is I want a nice straight top and straight sides. So, and also around the top edge of the cake, you want a nice uniform circle. So I've got about almost a kilo of marzipan. It's good to roll out a little bit too much and you can trim off the excess rather than not having quite enough. So I'm going to use a tiny bit of icing sugar on the surface, not too much. I don't want to dry out the marzipan, just enough so it's not going to stick to the surface. So give it a knead, make sure it's nice and pliable. So what we're trying to do when we roll out the marzipan is have a nice even thickness and have plenty to cover the cake. Sometimes when you're new to rolling out, you might get those big spidery bits that go off, and it's really annoying because you get big patches on the side of your cake. So there is a way to try and kind of avoid that, which I'll show you. I've got a large cake decorating rolling pin. These are really good. They're plastic, non-stick, nice size, so I can have control of my icing and marzipan. So I'm just going to take my pin, pop it in the centre of my marzipan and roll away from myself and then back towards. So I'm kind of like starting in the middle and rolling away, bringing it back and coming towards again, rather than going in one motion. So I'm going in one motion, I'm going to get those long spidery bits. So that does kind of help to minimise that happening. Give it a quarter turn. Again, making sure every time I turn it that I've got plenty of icing sugar underneath there. Not too much on the top. I don't want it to get any sort of cracks in it. There's just a tiny bit on the top. Again, in the middle and roll towards myself and then away. So I'm just going to now take my cake smoother and just polish that down, just to get rid of any of the ridges from my rolling pin before I pop it onto the cake. I'm just going to take my rolling pin and just wrap my marzipan over there. I find this the easiest way, it stops it from tearing. Now I've got complete control of my marzipan. It's going to come down at eye level, and this side I can see I've got plenty to cover this side, and it's nice in the middle, so I can just roll away over the top of my cake. And now just using my cake smoother, this one's what we call a top smoother, so it's got rounded sides all the way around. I'm just going to polish the top. And now, just using my hands, I'm going to encourage the marzipan to come right down over the cake. So I'm not going to drag down, I'm more pressing into the sides. So we want to avoid having any tears around the top, which can often happen to you when you're new to cake covering. But don't worry, if that happens, you can just knead it up and start again. That's coming all the way down to the surface, and your whole cake's covered, so that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. So I'm just going to take my knife and cut away the excess, leaving a couple of centimetres all the way round. So now this is a good tip for covering cakes. You want it to be very, very neat around the bottom, because when you've finished with your cake, you're going to be wanting to put some ribbon around it or perhaps some piping. So if it's nice and straight, you're going to get a really nice neat line. So I'm just going to take my smoother and just pull the icing, the marzipan, down below the bottom edge of the cake drum. So now taking my sharp knife, I'm just going to cut all the way around. I'm holding the knife against the board. I'm using that as a guide, and I'm going towards the centre and just trimming off all of the excess nice and neatly around the bottom of my cake. There we go, so that's all done. So as you can see, it's quite well covered already. I'm just going to pop that onto my turntable, and it does actually help if you stop it sliding about. Just a couple of bits of marzipan, just pop that on there. It's just going to help it stay still. So again, take the top smoother, just polish all the way over. And now, looking around the top edge, just using my hand, I'm just going to smooth all the way round. Now, if you find, again, you've still got a bit of a lump or a bump, you can still build it up with marzipan at this stage because we can smooth it over. So here, for example, I think, it's a little bit of a lump there. I'm just going to add a tiny bit to that piece because I can smooth over that, and you will not see that when we put the icing on there. So again, just using my smoother to kind of smooth that into the cake. There we go. So I'm going to take both of the side ones, coming down again to eye level, and I'm going to hold the cake still on one side, and then with my other hand I'm just going to use a gentle pressure just to push the marzipan against the sponge. Ideally leave it for a good few hours before you cover it with your icing, or perhaps even overnight is great because it's going to be nice and firm and set, ready for you to put your layer of sugar paste on. Right, so my cake is all marzipan, it's nice and set, it's skinned over, so now it's time for me to use my sugar paste and give it its final layer of icing. So I'm just going to moisten the surface of the marzipan with a tiny bit of vodka. Now you can use vodka or brandy. If you don't want to use any alcohol, make sure that you've boiled the water. Just want to make sure there's no bacteria in there. And again, especially if you're maybe using a fruit cake and you might be icing it for a few weeks or perhaps a month beforehand, you want to make sure that you haven't got any bacteria there. So alcohol or boiled water is what you need. So I'm going to be using some icing sugar again, quite a generous amount on here, and I've got about 1 kilo of sugar paste. Again, make sure that you do keep your sugar paste wrapped up because it will start to dry out within sort of 10-15 minutes, and that's when you can get problems with cracking, which does happen to a lot of people when they're first kind of decorating with cakes, and it does get quite frustrating. So just give that a knead, make sure it's nice and pliable. And again, I'm going to be using my rolling pin in the centre and coming towards me and away from myself, just to make sure that I'm not getting any odd shapes. And again, I want to get a similar thickness, about sort of 4 or 5 millimetres thickness is great, so that's going to cover up any lumps. It's a nice even thickness. And again, I'm going to use my smoother just before I pop it onto the cake, just to polish any of those undulations out. Okay, a tiny bit of icing sugar just on top of the icing before I put it onto my rolling pin. And again, exactly the same way that we did with the marzipan, just rolling that onto the pin. Just place my cake in the centre, and again, holding up the sugar paste. I've got plenty here. It's in the middle, and just roll away. Just going all the way around the top edge again, quite gently, just gently pushing the sugar paste against the side of the cake, making sure you don't get any creases, and just giving a twist round, all the way round, until that comes to the bottom of my surface. So now I'm just going to cut off the excess again, like I did before with my marzipan, so there's not too much weight when I lift it up. Sometimes the weight of the icing will actually pull it or make tears at the top of your cake, which you don't want. And again, I'm going to lift it up, got it at eye level now, and just taking a smoother and going all the way around the sides, just covering over the whole of the marzipan cake and drum. And then again, the same way, taking the knife against the board and just going towards the centre of the cake drum. If I go around with my knife and sort of pull away, you're going to get that kind of icing come away. So always kind of direct that as if you imagine that you're pointing towards the centre of the drum, but be really careful of your fingers. Okay, so I'm going to pop that back onto my board. Got a little bit of marzipan and water just to kind of hold it in place there. And now I can smooth it with my cake smoothers. Again, popping it onto my turntable, just coming down, just to double check again, nice and smooth, which it is. We've already done a lot of the work, taking my palms and just going all the way around the top edge, making sure that's as smooth as possible. And then taking my 2 cake smoothers, holding it on one side and just gently pushing the sugar paste into the side of the cake. So I'm just going to lift up my cake and just place that on top of my cake drum. Try and get it in the middle. Just make sure it's nice and equal. Right, so, okay, so for this cake, there's lots of different ways I can decorate it. I could simply add a ribbon to the bottom, or I could do some piping. So I'm going to show you how to do a piped pearl trim. I've got some royal icing in here. I've coloured it with a tiny bit of caramel, so it's a kind of ivory colour. And I'm just going to pipe the royal icing, and then just stop squeezing and drag away. Squeeze and drag. So this is what they call a snail trail. So just squeezing and dragging back, trying to keep all of the pearls an equal size. And this will set nice and firmly, so we could go over it with a luster or a paint. So now my cake is nice and finished around the bottom. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of brush embroidery. Now this is a really nice technique to learn. Using a gentle pressure, just allowing that to flow out. And again, then just going round 3, 4, 5. And even if it's a bit wobbly, with brush embroidery, it really doesn't matter, because we're going to be using our brush now to brush it down. So taking a damp brush, squeeze the excess water off. It's just plain water. I'm now going to touch the top edge of my piping and just drag towards the centre of the flower, all the way down. So it's going to be creating like a stitched on effect. And when you do it, when you're dragging it down with a paintbrush, if you've got any wobbly edges, it's not going to show. It's quite a rough look really, but once it's all together as one, it's really, really pretty, and it really does create that lacy look. So just dragging all the way down. Every time you pipe a flower, make sure that you brush embroider it straight away, because you will find within a few minutes that royal icing will begin to set and you won't be able to get that dragging effect. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm just going to go all the way over my cake, so I might make some larger ones, perhaps on the top. Again, if you are piping from above, you can use the gravity there. You don't have to kind of draw on the cake, you can let it fall. So just begin and let my petals drop out. I'm going to do a much larger one. Again, coming to the opposite side, number 3, number 4, and number 5. Try and work as fast as you can, just touching the top edge with the brush and using a pressure that pulls the icing down onto the cake, always angled towards the centre of the flower. So I'm just going to continue all over my cake. Once I've done all my floral patterns, I can put some centres in them. Again, I might like to pearlise them, perhaps use a larger one and do a few pearl centres, perhaps 5 in this one that's larger. And just allow this to skin over and set. And then I can go over that with a lovely topaz pearl luster. And now I've got my flowers in place, I can just freeform, just pipe my stems in between, and I can be completely random, just going from one flower to the other. So just go all the way over your cake until it's completely covered, and then perhaps you can add some fresh flowers or some sugar roses, which I shall show you how to make.